Right, kia ora. All right, we'll get started. So kia ora koutou, tupi ake o ki community, nō reira, ke te hea tuku mihi ki Waikato awa, ki maunga tautari maunga, ke te noho au ki te Whanganui-a-Tara, ko Brad aho, kia ora everyone. So my name is Brad, as Shomi said, I'm a member of the ISO, and I'll be speaking tonight on student organising for liberation. I'm aiming to talk for about 30 minutes or so, but I'm also keen for this to be a dialogue. So if you have any experience organising on campus, or if you have any questions about that or how to get involved, I'm really keen to hear from you afterwards. And everyone else can, I'm sure, speak to that who's got some experience. And a small content warning before I start. I will be depicting some police violence later, although this will be like a pretty small part of the talk. But in any case, if you do need to leave or if you need to step out at any point, please do take care of yourself. Okay, so I think it's clear to most of us here that capitalism is a horror show. In recent months, through the release of the Epstein files, we've seen a whole class of filthy rich businessmen and politicians trafficking and abusing children while they throw lavish parties on their islands. Meanwhile, what the rest of us poor and working class people get is organized abandonment. While our homes and communities flood in one state of emergency after another, suddenly we find that all the climate emergency response funding has dried up and is nowhere to be found. And then at uni, graduate roles have disappeared, job opportunities have dried up, and we're staring down the barrel of the worst unemployment levels in the last decade. And it can keep going on attacks on Te ICE raids, move-on orders for unhoused people that have just been announced, the rise of the far right globally, the invasion of Venezuela, massacres in Iran and Sudan, and of course, I'll be talking about the genocide in Palestine soon enough. It's pretty clear that something needs to be done, and it's clear, I think, that students and everyone in this room have a huge part to play in what comes next, whether we sit back and watch it happen or we organize to fight it. Because students organizing on this campus and around the world, I think, have been really instrumental and inspiring sites of resistance in these recent years. The protests and encampments for Palestine in particular have drawn so many people into radical politics and have provided fuel for the wider movement. And yet, it seems like we're at a turning point. The height of the encampments have now passed, protests have died way down, and I think we have a kind of a serious question to ask, which is where do we go from here? How do we keep up this momentum? So we know that Palestine is not free. We're still seeing airstrikes in Gaza, further annexation in the West Bank, and a so-called board of peace full of dictators and authoritarians who want to turn Gaza into a holiday resort. And the rest of the world isn't looking so great either. So it's worth, I think, taking a moment to think about the ambivalent position that students have in these movements. So on one hand, students have way more flexible lifestyles and schedules than workers do. It's fairly easy to attend a rally at lunchtime, campaign meeting the next afternoon, political meeting in the evening like this one. And if you need to skip a lecture, you can probably do that without the lecturer noticing. But it's much, much harder to walk off your job if you work at a cafe, and sometimes you can get into trouble that could be illegal. It's also one of the few places where mainstream politics can be challenged and questioned. Not every paper, Charter of Commerce, but it's still possible to write an essay on Marxism and fulfill the requirements. I know I've done this many times. And all this means, I think, that students can pick up on radical ideas and move into struggle much more quickly than workers can. So time and again throughout history, as we'll see, even in recent years of places like Nepal and Bangladesh, students have acted as a catalyst to energize this wider movement. And then on the other hand, students face major limitations. The flip side to being able to walk out on your class without your lecturer noticing is that if nobody notices, you don't have leverage. You might have 90% of the students skip class and will still keep going, but if 90% of a workforce walks off a job site, they can shut down the whole place. So it's far easier to wait out a student rebellion or a student strike because they are more like customers than they are workers. And perhaps the biggest challenge, I think, is the high turnover of students on campus. Because students typically finish study or move away to start work, your core team of organisers falls apart every 3 or so years. And in my experience firsthand, this makes it really, really hard to build enduring organisations that last and are able to pass on the institutional knowledge to the next generation of students. And I think this can help explain some of the problems that we're facing now, where we've seen a huge burst of activity on campus and then a struggle to maintain this as we move into the long term. So to help us address how to solve these problems, I've divided this talk into 3 sections. Learning from a movement in the past, assessing some of the present conditions, and then looking to the future. Okay, so starting with the past, I want to talk about this, which is the amazing Berkeley free speech movement, which started in 1964. And why this one in particular, and I'll give you a quote from a guy called Hal Draper, who was a socialist who played a major part in this movement and wrote this really wonderful book. He said it had everything in terms of American superlatives. The largest and longest mass blockade of a police operation ever seen, the biggest mobilization of police force ever set up on campus, the biggest mass arrest ever made in California or of students, or perhaps ever made in the country, the most massive student strike ever organized here. It was, in sum, by far the most gigantic student protest movement ever mounted in the United States on a single campus. And that's from his great book, The New Student Revolt. And I think, as well, it has a lot to teach us in the present. So what could have possibly caused all of this? It was all about the civil rights movement, where people all across the United States were fighting against racist laws that prevented Black communities from voting, from employment, from interracial marriage, and against segregated spaces like in schools. Students at the Berkeley campus in California had come back from their summer break in 1964, just like we have, having seen the March on Washington in 1963 and taken part in civil rights campaigns like voter registration drives in Mississippi. And inspired by these campaigns, mostly organized by Black activists in the South, they carried this momentum to the streets of Berkeley, which, much like now, has a reputation for being a progressive and liberal city with a Democratic governor. In reality, segregation still ran deep in Berkeley, and students led the way in mass picketing workplaces which refused to hire Black workers, basically shutting down their businesses until they signed fair hiring agreements. And the employers were fuming about this. One of them said, quote, "I'm not prejudiced, I just like to have an all-white staff." But the students kept going with an escalating series of wins against a local drive-in restaurant, a fancy hotel, and a string of car dealerships, and then culminating in a sit-in in the district attorney's office. Meanwhile, cops opened fire hoses on students, beat them up, and arrested them en masse until the courts were completely jammed with cases. And the university, working in collaboration with the state, decides to crack down on the students who organize these protests. They ban students from holding political meetings like this one, ban them from holding stalls like we did today, from postering, from collecting donations, and recruiting new members. They even wanted to stop some civil rights leaders like Malcolm X and James Baldwin from coming to talk on campus. And the university's president, Clark Kerr, called the place a knowledge factory, basically engineered for mass production where no deviations are tolerated. And keep that in mind because that'll come in handy later. Here are some of the great photos. There's a lot of great photos from this movement if you want to look them up. But the students, they don't stand for this at all. They call out the university's crap and decide to do all those things anyway. So on the first day of class, like yesterday, students come out with their stalls and their pickets and they refuse to leave. But the really amazing thing, I think, is their solidarity with each other, which is kind of what makes all the difference. Because the university decides they'll just isolate some of the leaders, they'll pick 5 students basically at random, and they move to expel them. Once the students hear that, 500 of them show up at the dean's office with the list of all their names on a statement which says, "Hey, we violated all these rules too. If you're going to expel 5 of us, you've got to expel all of us. And we're not leaving until you do that or until you back off." So it really, really puts them in this hard position. And I think it's a really key through line throughout the movement, which they learn from the civil rights movement, that you can take all of us or none of us. So that's what they do next. When things escalate, the dean calls the cops to arrest a protester, a guy called Jack Weinberg, who gets chucked in the back of a police car. Within seconds, students start to surround the car, and soon a few thousand have shown up. So as far as you can see, there are students surrounding this police car. And they sit there, they refuse to move, and it'll be a full 32 hours before that car moves. And if you've ever been in a long, stretched out demo before, you'll know that there's a real problem of keeping people's energy up. Like, it's really hard to have this momentum that lasts for 32 hours. So there's a real question, like, what do you do if you're in this situation and people are sitting down on the ground on the tarmac for 32 hours? You get on top of the car and then you use it as a platform to deliver speeches, which is pretty fantastic. So that's what these students do. They make speeches, they give some lessons on direct action, and they talk about the problems at the university. But these students are really polite. They take off their shoes before they get on the car. And yeah, it's great. And in fact, they have so much energy left over that the next day they get together and they form the FSM, the Free Speech Movement. And the same tactic continues. So every time the university tries to single out a few members, everyone bands together and stands in solidarity. So when the uni tries to remove students again, everyone shows up at Sproul Hall, which is one of the main buildings on campus. And one of the students, Mario Savio, gets up the steps and he delivers this fantastic speech. So someone has just compared the university to a firm, like a business. And he says, I beg you to consider, if this is a firm and the board of regents are the board of directors, and if President Kerr is in fact the manager, then the faculty are employees and we're the raw material. But we're a bunch of raw material that don't mean to be made into any product, don't mean to be bought by some clients of the university. We're human beings. There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even tacitly take part. And you've got to put your bodies on the gears, on the wheels, on the levers, on all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. You've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all, which I think is so great. And the students think so too. And they're so fired up that 1,000 of them rush into the hall. They spread throughout the halls, they occupy the whole space, and they take it over. And there's some great recorded audio of the chancellor who gets in the loudspeaker to tell off the students. And he informs them that the usual operations of the university have stopped functioning, and everybody cheers. It's like a whole celebration. Because everyone knows, when students take over things, they lead to chaos and bad behavior and so on, except for these students, because they completely transformed the university. Graduate students hold classes for anyone who wants to listen, in quiet study areas for others. They set up a press room, a food distribution system, and film screenings. In the lobby, Jewish students hold a Hanukkah service, and above them, the folk singer John Byers and others sing liberation songs. They declared the building the Free University of California. So you can kind of see that's the occupied Sproul Hall. This fantastic photo here. So by midnight, everyone settles down for the night. They're in for the long haul. They've got their sleeping bags. They're taking some naps. But in a few hours, they're woken by megaphones. The police are on their way, which then follows the largest mass arrest in California history. And it's pretty violent. Students are dragged and bumped down the stairs. Their arms are twisted and strong-armed or kicked. One reporter who wrote down a remark by one of the policemen saying, we should do like they do in the foreign countries, beat them senseless first, then throw them into the bus. That's what the policeman was saying. Meanwhile, climbing ropes dangled from the ends of the balconies. A few students climb inside so they can be arrested with all the other students and their friends, and a few others climb outside on special missions. One of those people making their escape is Steve Weissman, the head of the graduate students, and his special mission is to start up a strike on campus. So seeing all of this carnage that's happening at Sproul Hall, everyone basically agrees. A full 75% of the teaching assistants, the ones who actually take the classes, teach the classes, they go on strike. And they're not the only ones. The truck drivers and the Teamsters Union refuse to deliver anything to the campus. The carpenters put down their tools, they start building, they start preparing stuff. And the administration, they could wait, they could kick out the students, but they could do nothing about the strike because everything grinds to a halt at the university. To the point where the Oakland Tribune, which is like a right-wing newspaper in California, puts it like this. The Berkeley strike of December 3 to 7, 1964, lasting a full 3 school days, was undoubtedly the longest and most massive student strike in this country, and it demanded nothing less than a backdown of the administration and of the largest campus of the largest state university in the country. All over the state, newspapers who have been telling off students the whole time now do a complete 180. They pressure the university to allow for free speech and to call off the disciplinary hearings about the students who got in trouble. And that's pretty much what happens. Just a few months after it began its crackdown, the uni backs off from its restrictions and makes way for student politics. Then they fired the chancellor, the acting chancellor, and the president, and then they start again with a new administration, basically by the time the next year comes around. So some pretty inspiring stuff. And here's some of the students who are getting the good news. Okay, so that was part 1. Part 2, student justice for Palestine. So that was kind of the fireworks part. That was the exciting history. Now I'm going to go through some more measured reflections on organizing with student justice for Palestine, Pōneke, a campaign I've been really fortunate to be a part of, along with a few of our members here tonight. So I'm going to assume that a lot of you will know about SJP already, and you've probably come across us before, but I'll just give a quick introduction and then talk about some of what we've learned in depth. So SJP, we're a ropu of students and academics based at Te Waka, organizing solidarity with the struggle for the liberation of Palestine. We recognize the importance of centering the voices of Palestinians, whose lands we are organizing around, and tangata whenua, whose lands we are organizing on, in the movement towards our interconnected liberation. But I think it's really important as well to talk about our prehistory, because there's been such a rapid sort of upsurge in Palestine organizing. It's really easy to, I think, to skip what made that possible in the first place. So here, I want to highlight a few campaigns that you may not have seen. So firstly, over 10 years ago now, in September 2015, a pair of Israeli soldiers came to give a talk on our campus, and they were there, unsurprisingly, to spread propaganda for the Israeli state, which had just in 2014 launched a devastating operation in Gaza, so-called Protective Edge, where they killed over 2,000 people in 51 days. The university, of course, had no problem hosting the propaganda tour, and the event still went ahead. So academics put together a letter opposing the talk. A group of students and supporters, about 60 people or more, showed up to oppose them with flags and signs and megaphones. And the support was so sort of unusual at the time that it made national headlines like a number of times. And this will be a running theme. You'll notice that the leadership of our university has no spine. A few years later, in 2019, Students for Justice in Palestine, which was sort of a previous iteration of SJP, noticed that Vic was hosting an award called the Embassy of Israel Prize, awarded to one student each year if they could write on a topic, and one of which, and I quote, includes Israel's democracy in the context of the Middle East, and somehow they found something to write about. Unfortunately, this campaign just didn't have enough public support at the time, and the university refused to remove the prize and the prize money from the Embassy of Israel. But we'll come back to that. But keep in mind that this was during the 2010s, when protest activity was at a real low point during the Key government. But things really started to shift in 2023, when unis announced sweeping job cuts all over the country, and at Vic, they aimed to axe 229 jobs, which included cutting whole departments, which at first included theatre, like the whole theatre department. This drew in a whole new generation of students into political activity, bringing the struggle to campuses that had been depoliticized for a long time. So we protested, we teamed up with the union, we marched to Parliament, and at least at that time, we ended up saving about 100 jobs. And it was thanks to the experience that we gained in this organizing that these connections were forged and that student justice for Palestine was reimagined and reignited. And so that was sort of the precursors to what we were able to do, what students were able to do a little bit later. At the same time, there was also a bunch of organizing that did not happen. When encampments for Palestine sprung up at Columbia, then all over the world, most of these came from SJP groups who'd been operating for years and years at that point. They had already done the work of investigating and exposing the university's ties to Israel, to arms manufacturing. And they had structures and they had demands well before October 7th came. When the opportunity to do the same came on our campus, we had no information, we had no structures, we had no demands, and so there would be no point in camping out on the lawn because we didn't know what we were asking for. Had there been an enduring organization ready to take up the struggle when it needed it, things might have looked a bit different. But the power of these encampments, I think, was so strong, completely changed the context that we were working in. Because from that point, there was a kind of a spectre haunting the Vic Uni leadership, the spectre of student revolt. So every demand, every move that we made from that point on carried the threat that students were going to pitch a tent on campus. And this so terrified the uni administration that they kind of acceded to all our demands. So I really want to make this point because when we make this, we talk about solidarity or global connections, it's not just a symbolic thing. You know, it has very, very real effects in the way that we organize. And I would even suggest that if it wasn't for these encampments at Columbia, we may never have divested at Victoria. That's not all the solidarity that we had. Justice for Palestine, of course, was instrumental in supporting our actions, amplifying our events, giving us training and confidence. But I also want to acknowledge another side of support, which is organized labor. So much of our work, especially last year, was getting support from staff and faculty to pass the BDS motion through the academic board, which would commit the uni to severing ties with Israel into the future. And if it wasn't for the support from members in the Tertiary Education Union, TEU, we would have been totally lost because those were the people who not only knew the staff intimately and had relationships with them, but they were used to thinking about the workplace as a political space, not just like an academic or a social one. And it was on this basis, in many ways a class basis, that we can map out our support and forge new alliances with staff. And that point about political space is where I want to end this section. So some of our first actions within weeks of starting SJP were telling right-wing politicians to get lost, including Nicola Willis in early 2024, Clubs Day, the New Zealand military and mining companies at the Careers Expo. This is from an article that was written like telling us off. David Seymour later on, who lasted 13 minutes, which is a record low. And lastly, or the most importantly, Bonnie Jenkins, who was the US ambassador to arms, who was kind of the person representing, at this point, AUKUS, this big deal with the United States. And so she's on campus. Unfortunately, don't have audio, but thankfully people have taken these great videos. So there were people inside the room disrupting the talk, and then there were a bunch of us outside as well. When she came out. You can hear it. So someone was playing the Imperial March from Star Wars as she came out, which is fantastic. I think that was actually John Maynard, a local unionist. So she comes back. It doesn't last very long.
You had no place to speak here. Maitia wakite, moana free Palestine. Palestine, te kawana, kaki pero. Maitia wakite moana free Palestine.
Stop complaining the nation wants to reaching so
I'm fighting genocide.
And Sarah has this great idea to put up a video about AUKUS that she had made, which was an anti-AUKUS video that happened to be on YouTube. And so we got, in the education, we got a lecture, just not quite what they expected. So that was a very fun day. And so over time, we had more and more students joining these events, leading up to a sit-in at the Hunter Building, and some amazing graffiti that appeared and popped up all around campus saying divest from genocide around the end of 2024. Because of all this activity, the uni leadership and I think the ruling class more broadly could no longer make all these terrible decisions behind our backs or over our heads. Suddenly it was a negotiation that they couldn't always win. Students had sort of staked a claim, I think, for themselves. And as of 2026, Student Power has removed the Israeli Embassy Prize, forced the uni to divest from Israel, and passed a BDS motion through the academic board. So everyone in this campus has done really, really amazing work. So some conclusions for the future. Of course, then, as I mentioned, this is far from over. We still need to get the uni to commit to divestment so it doesn't change its mind later on. It actually did that with climate funding. It's still funding fossil fuels. And we still have so much organising to do around Te Tiriti, around Te Taiao, and much more. Meanwhile, the university is starting to stamp out some of this activity on campus. So when we got our email for Clubs Day that started today, they had a note that said we're explicitly not allowed to protest because there were going to be important politicians showing up, and there'd be repercussions if you did so. So there are three conclusions that I want to draw on as we move into the future. Number one, the university is not a democracy, but it could be. So you might have considered, maybe you haven't, what do university administrations, like the leaderships, what do they actually do? Like, what are they there for? Because they don't hire faculty or admit students particularly well, because faculty know best. They know the best scholars in their field, and they know how well students understand their subjects. They're not managing the campus, because there's a whole layer of admin staff who do that. So really, I think they're there to make sure the university fulfills its needs, the needs of the political system, to run the knowledge factory, producing X amount of STEM graduates, Y amounts of research and development, and then maybe a few humanities students if they have the extra money. I mean, our vice-chancellor at this campus earns a higher salary than the prime minister, and is part of a whole network of politicians and bigwigs in the business community. In other words, like really, really far from the working class and the concerns of the working class or the poor. And the second reason they're there is to run the university much like a business. And I'm borrowing from the writer Richard Seymour here, that when you run universities as a business, you treat students as consumers rather than citizens. There's a certain authoritarian logic here because you don't see consumers as political agents or allow for any democratic participation. So if you're a restaurant owner and your customers misbehave, you call the cops and you throw them out, and that's the same deal that they are sort of doing here on campus. Number two, movements don't spring out from nowhere. All new radical uprisings take place in the context of previous organising and take shape accordingly. In every one of the cases I've talked about tonight, there's been a huge layer of activists who were engaged long before the movements became popular, working away in the quiet times. And almost nobody talks about this because you don't see it. But the work they do, I think, is really vital. Students in Berkeley might well have failed without the organising skills they learn from Black activists in places like Alabama and Mississippi. And I wouldn't have a clue where to begin in any of the SJP actions that we've been involved in if that hadn't been for Students Against Cuts and if it hadn't been for my work in ISO. So the key, I think, is to build an infrastructure of dissent. Dissent and defiance being something you build and maintain so you can support these movements when they do erupt, and even more importantly, I think, sustain them when they begin to flag. Which brings us to the last point. Student movements survive in solidarity. I think the Berkeley campus showed this really well, that when students refuse to let a few people go down without everybody going down, that's when you begin to see the university struggle to deal with you. And as I outlined in the beginning, student movements are crucial catalysts in radical movements. They can move quickly and work flexibly, but student turnover is a real problem. It's incredibly hard to sustain these groups when they're tied to the timeline of a university degree, and every few years people disappear. The solution, I think, is to build a base which is driven by students, but includes a much more diverse cadre of people who won't leave every few years, can bring in their experience from their workplaces, and continue the fight in their workplaces as well. So students and workers, I think, have every reason to work together and to learn from each other. So taken together, I think this is the analysis behind a lot of our activity on campus, what we're trying to do here. And if you want to be a part of it, I welcome you to come along. So thank you so much for listening to this talk. And again, this is just my perspective. I'm really, really keen to hear from everybody in the room. Thank you.